How's it going, everyone? And welcome once again to another episode of Animal Talk Podcast in collaboration with SACA, the South African Animal Keepers Association. My name is Ryne.
And my name is Ayrton. Hey Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Looking forward to talking about an interesting topic for our podcast today.
It's going to be an interesting one.
I think it is going to be one. Ryan and I had been chatting and deciding on a topic, and I thought, why not try do a bit of a dive through the history of zoos and aquariums? So that's going to be our topic for today. And before we started the recording of this podcast, I just told Ryan how I really just went down a rabbit hole of all the really interesting things that happened over centuries of keeping animals, and how we have gotten from that to where we are today is actually really, really interesting. So hopefully our listeners are going to find this particular episode interesting if they enjoy history and they enjoy animals and they enjoy about learning, where we've come from. Really just a celebration of what a zoo is considered to be today versus what it was way back then.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting one. Let's dive in.
Awesome. So, Ryan, let's play a little bit of a game here. How if I talk to you about zoos, where do you think the first zoo was in the world?
That's a good one. It's probably in Europe somewhere. Must be in Europe.
Probably in Europe. Okay, we'll put that on pause for now,
Okay.
and we'll come back to that because through my history dive, what the facts tell us is that basically way back then we're not really calling zoos, zoos as we know them today. We're calling them menageries, which is basically just a collection of animals. And at that time, it was really more about a status symbol. So if you were very wealthy and you had all these rare and exotic animals that you should kind of house and showcase, it would ultimately showcase your wealth. Looking at the records, the kind of the first setup that we don't really know that much about because it was actually only really discovered in 2009, but there were artifacts and essentially fossils and skeletons found of animals in a place called Hierakonpolis in Egypt. What they found there was hippos, elephants, baboons, wildcats, and not only did they find all these different, rare skeletons of these animals, but they also found that some of them seemed to have injuries. But from what they could look at with the bone structure, it seemed like those injuries had been cared for and healed, which from what we're looking at is ultimately telling us that there was actually someone caring for these animals and there was
Oh, wow.
some form of sympathy and empathy involved in that time. And that dates back all the way to 3500 BCE, which
So
is
that's ancient Egypt.
that's ancient Egypt. So yeah,
Hectic.
really, really different.
I knew about the cats and pharaohs and all of that type of stuff, but didn't realize they had like that many wildlife animals in captivity.
Yeah, and also really a weird kind of combination. Obviously, a lot of species like from Africa, because I mean, we're talking about hippos, elephants,
It's the
baboons,
closest.
but it would make sense because it is, as you said, it is the closest. So that's kind of, we don't really know much more about that. We just have the ruins that are being discovered and excavated, and so we then jump to our next kind of menagerie, which is, if you look at the history, this is kind of considered to be the first kind of proper menagerie that we know of, and that was in 1235, which
Sheepers.
is like wild if you think about it. That brings me back to the question that I asked you because you said Europe, and you are 100% correct because that the Royal Menagerie was actually at the Tower of London.
Wow. Yeah, when you say Royal Menagerie, now it makes sense.
It's also very strange if you think, of the Tower of London we know today. Imagine keeping wild animals there. It's quite a strange concept. And the
Yeah, and
first,
it's very dark and dingy there.
very very dark and dingy. I know, when we think about London and the UK, we already think of like they don't get much sun, so it doesn't really help the idea of having animals in the Tower of London. It just doesn't seem like a good fit.
Strange.
And the records show that the first kind of grouping of animals that they had there, they were gifted to King Henry III, and those were three leopards. So we're talking about, you know, large cats here, which is quite interesting.
It doesn't state whether the leopards are African or Indian or anything like that. It just says leopards.
I couldn't find a specific species there, so they just state leopards. But then what I found, which was quite interesting, was they also housed, at a similar time, they housed polar bears, and the polar bears would apparently fish in the River Thames.
What? Polar bears fishing in the River Thames.
Like, can you just imagine this? In like, we've traveled back in time to 1235, which, first of all, it's a struggle for me to understand the year 1235 because obviously we're in 2026. But imagine going back in time and you're in the Tower of London and there's these really small, ornate cages, and they're housing these really exotic animals that you've never probably seen before in your lifetime.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very different times. And one thing that I found which was really, really interesting was for a large period of time, the menagerie was actually closed. It was just there. It was mainly for the king and the royal family, but it was around about the 18th century that, sorry, the 16th century that under the reign of Elizabeth I, that the menagerie was actually open to the public. And then during the 18th century, the price of admission for visiting the animals was 3.5 pence,
Wow.
or you could supply a cat or a dog to be fed to the lions.
What? No way.
So very different to what we know
I'm mind
as,
blown right now.
zoos today. And then the other last thing I'll touch on from the Royal Menagerie, which I found really interesting, was also in the 18th century. They got a group of ostriches.
Of course they did.
This just kind of played into the role of, at that time, menageries really are not, you can't compare them to the modern day zoo that we have today because there really wasn't a basic understanding of the animal's needs, their space requirements, their diets. And why I bring up this group of ostriches is because according to, the history, the ostriches were actually fed iron. That was their diet.
They were fed iron.
Blocks of iron.
Oh, wow. That is. Poor ostriches.
Poor everything, I think, at this stage. It's just, yeah.
Well, yeah, but just thinking about continuous blocks of iron, like I get we eat stones, but that's to help grind up stuff. But like iron, iron out of all the things, surely they didn't last that long on a diet of iron.
It really makes you think that if you were to be an animal in the royal menagerie, you would want to be a polar bear because you can at least go fishing in the river.
You'd get some sort of natural food and enrichment.
So we're now talking about, now we've traveled through that and we get to around the 18th century, and this is where we kind of start seeing things shift. And the 18th century is really kind of where we start talking about the modern public zoo that we know today, because during the 18th century, we had this period called the Age of Enlightenment, which is, it's quite fun to say. And this was a period in European history when basically science, reason, and logic were promoted as ideals of society and government. So the scientific focus of the Age of Enlightenment also extended into zoology, which would ultimately then extend to, animals being kept in menageries. And the kind of main shift for this was because during this time, people really wanted to study animals for scientific reason. They wanted, scientists wanted to research animal behavior and anatomy. And to do this, scientists needed people to actually, look after the animals, and the animals needed to really start surviving and thriving versus just being there and eating iron like the poor ostriches. They also started realizing that they needed to keep the animals in places where the habitats resembled similar, or I would say at this stage it would probably still be referred to as cages, resembled more natural habitats of where the animals were from, so that they could start trying to see some natural behaviors versus just having these animals in these small ornate cages.
Interesting, because you would think that yes, you would be putting them in there for the natural behaviors, but also having that natural environment could also be used for education, but we haven't got there yet in the mindset of zoological facilities of educating people. It's more about entertainment for this point.
Yeah, it really is. It's I think it's shifting now. At this period, we started off, the focus was having animals as a status symbol. Now we've moved over to kind of having them in these cages for entertainment and for public view. Now we're starting to understand that these creatures need a bit more than just a cement cage and a inappropriate diet. So the kind of first modern day zoo, which also started out originally as a menagerie, is in Vienna, Austria, and it is still actually operating today. It's Tiergarten Schönbrunn, and that opened as a menagerie in 1752. Today, it's also a World Heritage Site. Obviously, over time, they've expanded the habitats and they've created more natural environments for the animals. But when we look at the history, that's basically the first kind of modern day zoo that started incorporating all these other ideas that, animals need more than just a small cage.
Yeah, wow. I wonder if you said that name right, because I would not be able to get that right. Say it again.
Wow, you're really putting me on the spot here, hey? So it's Tiergarten Schönbrunn, if I'm saying it correctly. Schönbrunn.
Schönbrunn.
Yeah, so that's
I wonder if we've got any listeners that work there. That would be interesting.
yeah. If you're listening and you work there, or you know somebody that does work there, let us know, because that would be really interesting. And then the next kind of jump in our timeline, we move to France, and this is also quite a fun one to say. This is the Menagerie de Jardin des Plantes, and that is in 1794. So, kind of a good few years after Tiergarten Schönbrunn had opened, and this was basically a collection of animals that were seized during the French Revolution. They were destined for Versailles, and after the French Revolution, they were seized and they needed to go somewhere. So, in our timeline, that's essentially the next kind of zoo, but it's more a botanical garden that had some small animals housed in it as well. But then we have interesting things happening, because so that's in France in 1794, and then in 1830 we jump back all the way back to the Royal Menagerie, because now things are shifting. People have a little bit better understanding of what animals require. The Royal Menagerie closes in 1830, but now these animals need to be sent somewhere. So while the Royal Menagerie is starting to close, there's another kind of more modern day zoo opening, and that is what we know today as the London Zoo, that opened in 1828. Wasn't open to the public yet, but it was starting to house animals. So some of the animals from the Royal Menagerie were sent to London Zoo in 1828. Some were also sent to Dublin Zoo, which we'll talk about a bit as well, and that was in 1831 when the Dublin Zoo was built, because this same architect who was involved in the London Zoo was involved in the Dublin Zoo. So we have some animals being sent there, and the Royal Menagerie is closed. And then the London Zoo officially opens in 1847. and over the years starts really developing these new ways of exhibiting animals, because in 1849 they are basically credited to having the first reptile house that we know of in a zoological facility, which is quite
Oh,
cool.
wow. That's
um,
very cool.
yeah, and it's just crazy to think that, London Zoo is still open today. So a
It's
lot of,
almost 200 years old.
yeah, it's crazy. I think the aquarium, we've just celebrated our 30th birthday. Like there's no way of
I'm just a
even
baby.
there's no way of even comparing that kind of age of a facility to a place like London Zoo. And talking about an aquarium, in 1853, London Zoo opens what they call aquatic vivarium, which ultimately then gets turned into the word aquarium, and is also credited for having the world's first aquarium in a zoological facility.
Wow. Interesting history. Yeah.
So all these like world firsts. Yeah. But the credit of the aquariums also can't go unnoticed by the Romans, because the Romans are technically credited for being the first kind of group of people to create marine systems. So they get credit for having the first marine aquarists, which is quite cool. And they had designed ponds that would basically be supplied with fresh seawater that they could keep saltwater critters alive in, which is quite interesting. And
Oh,
then
that sounds familiar.
it does sound familiar. And then, of course, if you think of fish, there's one place you can't not include in, the breeding and keeping of fish. And in particular, we're talking about koi and goldfish. And that place would obviously be China, because
Huh.
in the 1300s, there was a Chinese porcelain company that produced these large tubs, which were specifically designed for keeping goldfish. And over time, that then morphed into fish bowls and morphed into fish tanks. And that's how we got, the aquariums and fish tanks that we know today.
Wow.
So a bit of a jump around, but then jumping all the way back again to the London Zoo in 1881, they had their first exhibit of live insects, which is also a world first for zoos. So London Zoo really just leading the way. And then, as I mentioned, some of those animals that had gone to London Zoo, some of them from the Royal Menagerie, also went to Dublin Zoo, which opened in 1831. Bristol Zoo opened in 1836. Unfortunately, it closed in 2022, but it still continues to run as a basically a closed facility now known as the Bristol Zoo Project, where they are doing work with endangered species. So this up until this time, this is really we're talking about like land animals. There's not much. There's a little bit of aquarium stuff happening here, but when we then do a shift to, if we're talking about large marine mammals, the first time we see that come up in history is, maybe I should ask you, where do you think the first kind of dolphin exhibit opened in the world?
Ooh, that's a that's an interest. It will be. Huh. Would that not be like North America?
North America, so like Florida, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, so of course, if we talk about, if we're thinking about captive marine mammals, you can't not think of Florida.
Yeah.
And that was Marineland of Florida, which opened in 1938. And they were basically the first place to house dolphins and do what we don't really call them today as dolphin shows or public presentations using dolphins. So really just a very interesting history of where we got to. And I think for dolphinariums and for aquariums, even though they had just started out, you know we mentioned, yeah, in 1853 the aquatic vivarium opens at London Zoo, and then Marineland of Florida opens in 1938. It's still that today we are still discovering new things about fish and marine mammals. So it's really like the land animals were a little bit more ahead because we'd been keeping them for longer over the years. And then only much later on, we started keeping fish and reptiles and insects and working out essentially their husbandry and their requirements.
Yeah, you know, as I think more and more about it, it's really cool to see the change and the shift over the years. And it just means to me, and is exciting to me, it's how it's going to even move even more when we jump to our present day and what the future holds for animals in captivity under human care and conservation. So that's the exciting part because you can see how it has developed over time and it's going to always be developing because as we learn more and more, like you said, we're still learning. As we learn more, we'll be able to improve things for even better future of animals under human care.
Yeah, I've always related to the saying that when we know better, we do better. And I think that really just describes the zoological industry. I know there's a lot of people that still are very much against zoos and aquariums. And, I think everybody's entitled to their opinion and their own decision about whether they want to choose to support zoos and aquariums. But I think we also, you need to have the correct facts of, again, where this all started, what the conditions were like back then, and actually looking at the modern day zoo and seeing, how much care and effort actually goes in to creating natural habitats, to that goes into diet, that goes into enrichment, animal observations, behavior. It's such a different industry compared to, how it started out. And it is really exciting because the more we understand about these animals, the more we know what their needs are, what their requirements are, the more that we can provide for them in such a way that it's really just beyond beneficial. It's not just looking after animals in cages anymore. It's actually trying to create a balanced ecosystem that they can be part of, providing them with food in different ways that's enriching. And then also, the conservation side of zoos. If you look at, back in the day, it really wasn't about breeding programs and endangered species. It was about keeping these cool, rare things. And there's been such a shift in zoos and aquariums now about, endangered species and really just having these populations that are there as almost like a species survival plan. Just thinking off the top of my head, we can list a few like the giant panda, the California condor. I know the Komodo dragons, Galapagos tortoises. A recent one was axolotls that there was a article that I read recently that it's only recently we've realized that axolotl that have been bred in captivity can actually be released and can actually adapt to being released back into the wild. So there's so many species, and that's just a few. There's so many more that are part of breeding programs. And there's so many success stories out there of what zoos have done positively for species. And I think we really need to focus on that and take that into consideration before judging zoological facilities.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of the big things for me is there's so much stuff that you can learn from our captive collections of animals where you can't study that type of stuff out in the wild. And we learn so much about how the species have evolved over time and how they deal with certain changes. And this all betters is well, it will make it better for wild animals because we can ensure that those things are kept correct in the wild because we see how they affect captive species. So there's a lot of stuff that zoological facilities, aquariums, those type of stuff that really do for the wild populations to ensure their longevity for future generations.
Definitely. And, there's definitely this idea, and I think something that I really strive to do in my own capacity as an animal keeper, as an aquarist, is really to just always kind of do a self-assessment on what you do as a keeper and what your facility does, and try and just realize, where the gaps are, and raise those concerns and issues that you have, because it really does takes an army to run the facilities that we work in. It is really easy to, over time, become complacent with, we've spoken about scheduling. It's really easy to become complacent on diets because we've done it a certain way for a certain period. So this is kind of how the diets are. So it's really up to the individuals in the industry to really just kind of sieve through everything you do, and not in a critical negative way, but you have to, almost like with a fine tooth comb, go through everything that you're doing in a day, and really just see how we can, better do it based on new information that we get. Go out there, read papers, look at the new research that's being done, look at that's also why I think, soccer is so important, why associations and different, keeper groups are really important, because it's bridging this gap between facilities. It prevents us from reinventing the wheel. And through knowledge sharing, if someone knows better in another facility, we need to really share those skills and share that knowledge with other facilities, and really adopt those practices so that we can give those animals a better quality of life, adjust our ways in which we work, so that we can ultimately do better, because that's really what's happened over the years, and it's that those small changes over time that really benefits and ultimately shapes the zoo industry that we know and appreciate today.
100%. Yeah, this topic could definitely go on for quite some time. So I think it's a good opportunity now to open it up to our listeners and pretty much say, if you guys want to get hold of us and chat a little bit more about the history of zoos and how they've progressed, and also, if you want to get involved with soccer or any other animal keeper association throughout the world, look them up. Sarka's details are on our social media, they're on our podcast episodes, so you can have a look at that. And if you do want to get hold of us directly, you can email us on animal.talk201@gmail.com. And then we also have our social media.
Of course, we're on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Our handle is at Animal Talk Podcast _ZA. Please go and like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as our other profiles. And, please just help us to get our profiles out there. The more you like and share them, the more there's opportunity for other keepers to see our platform, to also get involved, to help us to share all of this information, and ultimately unify all our keepers around the world.
Yeah, definitely. And it's great to hear from everyone and hear your experiences and your knowledge. So please share what you can with us. We really like to hear from you. From myself, animals are our passion.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to another episode of Animal Talk Podcast. And remember that our quality of care is their quality of life. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. How's it going, everyone? And welcome to Animal Talk Podcast. And I just messed that up. Let's try that again.
Welcome back.
Ha ha ha. Here we go.